Thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. It's an honor for me to be included among such prestigious researchers and philosophers. I should also say that actually I'm quite a local person because I've been here for last 2 years. And actually I've been kind of living a cyber existence where my physical presence does not always correlate with my virtual presence. Because I still run my lab in India, in Hyderabad. Anyway, so I will talk to you about the change of norms and creativity and mostly give you some examples, actually a bunch of examples to think about some of the issues that I will raise, and some of them are meant to be provocative. So, I hope you'll attack me or ask questions or whatever. Okay, so actually I start with a quote by Gandhi. It says, an error does not become truth by reason of multiplied propagation, nor does truth become error because nobody sees it. A truth stands even if there be no public support. It is self-sustained. And I think it captures at least one very central aspect of normativity, and also, as we heard in the first talk this morning, that it has to be sort of, it's not just a matter of popularity or social practices. So for example, we'll look at examples of slavery, that if you say slavery, well, everybody accepts it. But when we have a normative discussion, it's not about whether you accept it or not. Or if you look at the debate, like abortion debate, and there are pro-choice people and there are people who are pro-life. But it's not like pro-choice people are anti-life, It's just, but still the debate is about trying to reach consensus perhaps, or trying to figure out what that truth is. And I'm going to explore some cognitive dimensions of that. So basically what I'm going to be arguing is, this is actually, I'm going ahead a little bit. So what are norms? They are considered to be objective mind independent. They don't depend on the public opinion or accepted social practices. And then, and again, this I'm repeating from what we heard in the first talk today, that they play a key role in various human endeavors. For example, in law, what is right, what is wrong. Language, for example, direct reference in natural kinds. Science and mathematics, ontological issues. Religion has morality issues. Art has aesthetics and things like that. Okay, so okay, now I'll go to the one that I was going to talk about. So what I'm going to basically argue is that norms are cognitive constructs. So though they have an objective component, but they are nonetheless shaped by a cognitive interaction, and they can change as individuals and societies evolve. Nonetheless, this evolution is kind of non-monotonic. So it is not that we are like trying to reach some ideal state and then every iteration brings you closer to that. And creative insights often manifest such revolution. So as I said, in the short time that I have, I'll mostly give a bunch of examples, and maybe not, I don't have enough time to carefully construct an argument for each of the points that I'm going to I have here, but at least I hope I will give you some food for thought. Okay. So actually I start with a very one example of normativity in language. And I think many of you may be familiar with Saul Kripke's work on direct reference theory. This was in like 1979 or so when he gave, I think at Princeton University, he gave those lectures which were in naming and necessity. And around the same time, Hilary Putnam was developing his theory of natural kinds. Anyway, so now actually again, this is not so much, my point is not so much about the theory of direct reference. But I'm just going to take one argument that Kripke made, and using that argument, I want to illustrate the cognitive dimensions of normativity. Okay, so just for those of you who may not be so familiar with it, or just to jog your memory, in the direct reference theory of proper names, names are designators of their reference, and any descriptions associated with the reference are incidental, and descriptions do not define the referent, and names are not a label for a cluster of descriptions. Okay. Actually, again, I summed up a bunch of things here. It's a little picture there. So like if you have a referent and then you have a lot of descriptions of it. So in the description theory, the name is a kind of a label for all these descriptions. And you can take some variations on that. So for example, you could have a prototype theory where you can say that Some of those descriptions are really essential. You can even use like kind of family resemblance theory of Wittgenstein or something like that, where you say that, well, I'm not going to say which ones are essential, but some subset of those, you know. So there are all these variations, and I mean, you know, Kripke goes through all of them. But in the direct reference theory, the idea is that those descriptions are actually incidental, so I've kind of graded those connections, but the name actually directly refers to whatever the referent is, okay? Now, as I say, my point here is really I'm using this as an example to illustrate one aspect of normativity. So I'm taking one argument of Kripke against the description theory of names, where he said that descriptions can turn out to be in error, okay? So he uses this, he actually has many examples, like Gödel may not have proved the incompleteness theorem. So for example, most people would consider that, you know, the man who proved the incompleteness theorem would be Gödel. I mean, he also considered like Peano's axioms, and then the man who came up with the Peano's axioms was Peano. Actually, it turned out that Peano's axioms were actually discovered by Dedekind. And he has a footnote for that, but people identify that with Peano. Anyway, so what then Kripke argues, and he made a very careful, very detailed argument that even prototypical descriptions may turn out to be in error. Most descriptions may turn out to be in error. And here's a little jump there, which I'm going to emphasize. And he said, like, all descriptions may turn out to be in error, okay? So you can, you know, he kind of does that. And there's a little slip from most to all that I'm going to object against, okay? So the one of the, if I look at it from a cognitive point of view, if all the descriptions associated with a name turn out to be in error, the question is that how do we discover it? How can we find out if all the descriptions are wrong? Because you don't have access to a referent. And I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of examples in art. I'm taking them from art. So this is an example of an error discovery. Maybe some of you may have known this story of the Van Meegeren forgery. It's a very celebrated case that in 1930s and 1940s, he was a Dutchman, and he painted a number of paintings in the style of Johannes Vermeer, who was a famous Dutch painter. And those paintings were vowed to be authentic Vermeers by art experts and museum curators. They even had them in, for example, in museum in Rotterdam and stuff like that. And one of the paintings was bought by Göring, actually, during the war. I have some examples to show you. So this is Van Meegeren. He painted it around 1936. And the art experts claim that it's the finest Vermeer ever seen. Okay. This is actually, you can read, this is an original Vermeer. This is another one. This is the one, the Christ with adulteress, which was sold to Göring for 1.65 million guilders. And as a matter of fact, that was his undoing, because after the war, when they were trying to trace all the people who collaborated with Nazis, so he got caught, and then the charges were brought against him that he collaborated with Nazis, and for which he could have been hanged. So he kind of he had to make a choice between getting hung or admitting that it was a forgery. So he admitted that it was a forgery, but people didn't believe him. They thought he was just saying that in order to save his neck. And because all art experts said, no, he could not. These are really authentic Vermeer. So I think I have a picture here. Sorry, so this is another Vermeer. And yeah, so as a matter of fact, he actually painted a Vermeer in the courtroom, monitored by judges and all, to demonstrate that they really were forgeries. Quite an interesting case, actually, because for forgery, the punishment would have been much less, but he actually died before the judgment could be rendered, like sometime in 1945 or something. Okay. Now maybe I have it in the next slide. So now how were people sure of fake Vermeers? Actually, even after he painted that, it was not such a clear-cut case, because art experts, they didn't want to be they did not want to admit that they were wrong. So they actually they said, no, they don't believe it. But later on, when they started doing this, X-ray crystallography and analyzing the pigments, the paint pigments and things like that, And then that confirmed that the certain Vermeers were fake because the material that was used did not exist in the times of the Vermeer. The point is that, if you look at it, I mean, you have to imagine a little bit, or I can do a more detailed historical analysis but basically you have a number of descriptions, and then you use some descriptions to get to the referent, then you do some other analysis, and on the basis of that you conclude that certain other descriptions are not correct, and the description being in this case that it's a fake, the Vermeer did not paint this particular picture. Okay, so the descriptions are very essential because if you do not have descriptions, cognitively, those are the means by which we access the referent. That's the point I want to make. But actually, another more modern example, I don't know if you guys know this story about Wolfgang Beltracchi. That case was actually last year, it was in the news and all. He also was a very famous forger. And so here is, for example, is this fake Ernst Mach Hees painting, and Dorothea Tenning, who herself was, I think, some artist of some note, and she, when she saw, I don't know if this painting or one of the paintings that was sold as Ernst Mach's painting, she said that it's the most beautiful picture that he ever painted. Okay, sorry, go back. So this, in this story also, it's actually interesting because they again used, he slipped, actually the story behind it is also sort of interesting, that what happened is that, from a creativity point of view, what is actually interesting in this paintings is that he actually could paint it in like 2 or 3 hours, such a fake. The tricky part is not in creating a fake. The tricky part is in creating a story to go behind the fake, because you cannot just take out a painting and say it's some famous Vermeer or whatever. You have to make a story behind it. How did you come across it? What is the background of that? And that's where the creativity lies, actually. They come up with very creative ways to figure out, that how like somebody has discovered some lost paintings, and then they also have to fit in with the historical account of whatever they knew of the life of the painter or things like that. Because art experts are also experts. They know a lot of history and things like that. So given all those factors, they actually invent that. And in his case, again, basically what had happened was that there was some one of the famous auction house. They sold some painting for I don't know, maybe 2 million euros or something to somebody, but it's just a little slip up. They forgot to give a certificate of authentication, which normally they used to get it from art experts, and then they asked for it, and then they gave it to somebody else who was a little more thorough. So they did actually X-ray crystallography of the painting, and this guy also was very careful normally because he knew about this history of like Vermeer and Van Meegeren. So he did not actually use this thing, but he slipped. He made an error. So he used a paint that had some titanium, something that did not exist in the time of this thing, and that was his undoing. And once thing is discovered, then a whole lot of these things came out. You can actually follow that in the news, because as I said, the case was decided, I think, in like July or June or July 2012. So it's a very recent case. Okay. Now I want to give you some examples in law, and what I call conceptual change is essentially that when you coin a concept, how do people kind of redefine that and look at that? So, for example, one of the this is Amendment 5th in the U.S. Constitution, that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, and blah blah blah. It's a long clause. The issue is the concept of person. So, what's a person? I mean, you think, well, it's a very obvious thing, However, so there was this very interesting case, Standing Bear versus General Crook, from 1879, where this Judge Dundee, he issued an order releasing the Ponca Indians. And what he said is that I must hold that Indians, and consequently the relators are other people that were along with them, are persons such as described by and included within the law before quoted. Actually, it's a very interesting case because it looks like the Standing Bear was against General Crook, but actually General Crook, I mean, he was a general who had also fought with Native Americans and other during the Civil War as well. He actually was very sympathetic to the Native Americans. So what had happened was that this group of people, including Standing Bear, they they escaped from a reservation because they did not want to live the life of the reservation. So they escaped, and then they were caught, and the government was actually ordering them back, but they didn't want to go back because they didn't want to, in the reservation you live like life like, confined, and so they didn't want to do that. And so then the General Crook, he actually, like found a lawyer or persuaded them to file a lawsuit against the government and using the Fifth Amendment, okay, that they could not be, they had no cause to be, held or shipped back to or sent back to the reservation. Actually, there's a very nice speech that is Standing Bear made in the code that goes with it, but that's not really relevant to normativity, so I didn't talk about it here. Actually, I also should mention this. Another actually very related issue this person is this issue of abortion, for example. Well, I mentioned that earlier. So the thing is that if you look at it, of course, the life, well, I mean, from what we know about biology now, so life, the egg is fertilized, and then you can see in this picture just shows that it goes through various stages, and now people have studied that, so you can say at some point the heart develops, the brain develops, you can hear the heart beating and things like that. And now but the thing, if you look at even the legal issues or religious issues, it's sort of debate about, well, when can we apply the laws of a person to a developing fetus. So, of course, I mean, arbitrarily at the moment, for example, there's a third trimester law in the US. And so it looks arbitrary, but at some point one has to draw the line because, and also at least as long as the baby is in the womb, there's always a conflict of interest because if, for example, the life of the mother is threatened and the life of the baby is threatened, but it's, like whether should the baby be aborted or basically killed so that the mother's life can be saved, or the baby's life is more important and the mother's life is expendable. Okay, so those are the kind of choices that, or at least things that, so even now, if you look at the debate about abortion, and of course there are a lot of emotional things people bring into the debate, but nonetheless, one way to think about it is the notion of person, or that is still kind of evolving. So we can look at it from the like fetal point of view. We can also look at it from the race and other. I think it's in my next. No, sorry, it's. I have actually, I'll show you the later slide, the history of voting rights, for example. So if you look, for instance, that how did the, the voting rights developed? So, for example, in the, when the US Constitution, so this is again, I'm talking in the US history, that initially when the Constitution was declared, which again, they made a big deal about this freedom and liberty, but it really was the white males who own land or taxable wealth, they could vote. Then it was expanded to white males, then to African Americans in 1870, and then women in 1920, and then person 18 years of age or older in 1971, and that actually came about because of the Vietnam War, because people were saying that, I mean, the country can send them to war, and they can die for the country, but they are not allowed to vote. Okay, so there was a little bit of contradiction there. Again, the point I want to again emphasize is that as these new situations come, we look at this concept of, what is a person, for example, and then we kind of redefine them or redescribe them, and new issues come up, and so the concept is kind of evolving, and not always in a linear way. Then I go back to this other example I had, which is also very interesting. This is this concept of terra nullius. Terra nullius means basically like land that was unoccupied or there was nobody there. And this is even actually recent because in 1992, the Australian High Court held that previous decisions holding that Australia was terra nullius, that settlement, were wrong at law. So the interesting thing is that the court did not decide to change the law, because sometimes, of course, as the situation changes and people become, like for example, if you look at this voting rights thing, then they actually explicitly change the law. But here the court did not decide to change the law to accommodate modern development in the way we see this done in fields as diverse as homicide, for example, new defense for battered wives. This is in the context of Australian legal system, or tax, making modern day tax evasion illegal, or discrimination law. But the court went back to the basic terra nullius formulation at the time of white settlement and concluded that the previous codes were wrong according to the law at the time. This is very kind of unusual because normally legal, the sort of the law is very conservative. They don't normally change things like that. And notwithstanding prior cases to this effect, the High Court said that Australia could not have been an empty landed settlement because there was Aboriginal presence. Okay, and that meant that at the law of the time, it was a colonized country. Okay. And so they were actually like, going back and redefining this concept of terra nullius and applying it retrospectively, so to say. Okay, so this I sort of talked about. Okay, actually I want to show you a video. Oh, sorry, I have to. I don't know how to do this. Maybe. Can I? Maybe I'm here. Hold on.
Surrounded by black faces.
Oh, sorry, it's difficult to see there.
Every day, day in, day out. I only had one question. Why don't they kill us? Now, right out there on that porch, 3 times a week for 50 years, old Ben here would shave my daddy with a straight razor. Now, if I was old Ben, I would have cut my daddy's goddamn throat, and it wouldn't have taken me no 50 years to do it neither. But he never did. Why not? See, the science of phrenology is crucial to understanding the separation of our 2 species. In the skull of the African here, the area associated with submissiveness is larger than any human or any other subhuman species on planet Earth. Notice 3 distinct dimples. Here, here, and here. Now, if I was holding the skull of an Isaac Newton or Galileo, these 3 dimples would be found in the area of the skull most associated with creativity. This is the skull of old Ben. And in the skull of old Ben, unburdened by genius, these 3 dimples exist in the area of the skull most associated with civility. Now, bright boy, I will admit you are pretty clever. But if I took this hammer here and I bashed in your skull, you would have the same 3 dimples in the same place.
Okay, this is actually, I don't know if you see, anybody seen this movie? This is the Tarantino movie, Django Unchained. And I go back to my, here. Okay, so he actually, this is from the movie, but he's talking about phrenology. And, but in the middle of the 19th century, it was sort of, well, science, now we call it pseudoscience, but only because our concepts have changed. I have actually in the, next slide. There were actually a lot of, very celebrated scientists and philosophers. They actually, even if you look at the Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish guy who actually came up with this, did a lot of fundamental work on taxonomy, sort of taxonomy for plants or animals. And then Kant actually wrote a very interesting monograph on the different races of man. And there were all these things, and including most recent one, the bell curve by Hurstein and Murray. The point is that, again, what I want to make is that if you look at it, I mean, now we can look, or you can look at it and you say, well, they were, it's like pseudoscience. But actually, at that time, they had a problem. I mean, they were like European people. They looked different. Then they went to Africa, Asia, and Americas or Australia. They encountered people who looked different, and not just looked different. They behaved differently. They had different kinds of things, and they were trying to understand that. And they were sometimes, like in this video you saw, they pick up some parts, like maybe some dimples in the skull or some other kind of aspect or things like that. So in that sense, and of course, as we know more and more, so if you look at the bell curve book, for example, which is very recent, they were trying to show some genetic evidence that, some certain people are inferior or things like that. And again, I should also mention that this racism does not necessarily mean negative thing, because like some of the people who believed in phrenology, they wanted to be kind. They were saying, well, it's like these people are inferior, we should help them grow or things like that, And even in the bell curve, kind of, if you assume that hypothesis, you could say, well, okay, some people are inferior, so we should help them. But it takes a kind of a condescending attitude towards certain races or certain species. And again, the only point I want to make here is that how this concept has been changing or evolving, okay? And as we learn more and more, we learn more about, now we are doing imaging, brain imaging studies and things like that. And we are learning more about the brain and about cognition, about physiology. Our concept of what constitutes a person keeps changing. Actually, now this another example. This I take it from sports. I don't know. This is actually an interview. Maybe you recognize who is the person. You said to me earlier you didn't think it was possible to win without doping. Not in that generation, and I am not here to talk about others in that generation. It has been well documented. I didn't invent the culture, but I didn't try to stop the culture, and that's my mistake, and that's what I have to be sorry for, and that's what and the sport is now paying the price because of that. So I'm sorry for that. I didn't have access to anything else that nobody else did. Do you know anybody who is talking? Right. It's Lance Armstrong interview. There's another one. Do you feel in any way that you were cheating? So again, I'm using this example of cheating. I mean, cheating is again a little bit like a normative concept. And he said that, no, because, because when everybody is doing that, and there's, again, a perception between what is the actual, like, stated rules and what are the actual rules, and he felt he was playing it by actual rules. Actually, you can also read some interviews about some other bicyclists who actually quit the career in racing because they felt that when they started, that there was pressure on them to take drugs, and if they did not take drugs, there was no way they could compete with the actual people who were doing well. So for them, the option was either to quit or to, did what Armstrong did. And at some point, he also people also said, he knew the other rules of the game, and he did the best he could according to those rules of the game, which is that the rules about how the things are tested and how to evade that and things like that. Okay. Actually, this again, this is an older example, but I want to bring up, I don't know if you know that this is in, I think, maybe in early 90s, there was another case like that, and Ben Johnson, who was a Canadian athlete, he was given a lifetime suspension for testing positive twice for a banned substance. And this case went to the court, and actually in some other research I did about creativity in legal reasoning, I used this example of this argument because Johnson's lawyer said a lifetime ban means that one talent that he has taken pride in, he can't use to make a living. And the Athletic Federation's lawyer said it's a little like saying that a jail sentence imposed on a jewel thief with a restraint of trade. Okay, so there's another actually example on, but I'll maybe skip that. We don't have so much time. Now, just give you a couple of examples of conceptual changes in science. The thing in science is that the norms dictate the methodology that is acceptable in science. And however, this methodology evolves and changes drastically from time to time. So it is actually a very interesting example of Francisco Sizzi's argument against Galileo when Galileo had discovered the moons of Jupiter. And I should say Francisco Sizzi was also a very well-known, respected Italian He's credited in discovering that the sunspots move and stuff like that. And here is what he said. There are 7 windows in the head, 2 nostrils, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a mouth. So in the heavens, there are 2 favorable stars, 2 unpropitious, 2 luminaries, and Mercury alone undecided and indifferent, from which and many other similar phenomena of nature, such as 7 metals, etc., which it were tedious to enumerate, we gather that the number of planets is necessarily 7. Now, again, now people use that actually as an example of pseudo-scientific reasoning or simply bad scientific reasoning. But if you go into the methodology acceptable at the time, they actually were a lot of science used to be done by this kind of making analogies and things like that. I mean, this is actually based on a little bit like Aristotelian logic. And of course, and actually he also said, it's not in this quote, later on he said that, and in any case, we don't see those moons by naked eye, so they cannot affect us. And so he was also arguing against the Galileo's use of telescope. And I should say, actually, nowadays, I can give you similar quotes by people who make arguments against the use of imaging technology to study brain. Very well respected people sometimes say, well, people who are basically very dualist, they say, well, all this imaging data means nothing at all, because what we really go by is how I feel about it. And imaging data tells me nothing about this phenomenal, the phenomenal world that I experience. Actually, I mean, I didn't do it, but I can take some quotes which are exactly the same kind of argument and put them next to each other. This is actually another example. I won't talk about it. This theory of continental drift. It's now accepted, but you can see it actually went through several people noticed it, and then the idea changed and things like that, and then now people accept that continents for like floating bodies, but I'll skip that. This is another example of whales, how the whales became mammals. So again, I'll maybe just mention that example without going into details of the history of that, because again, the point is that if you look at each, look at the details of that, what kind of arguments people were making and how the concept evolved of fish, that they were considered, whales were considered as mammals and not fish, So, okay, this is actually one of my favorite example of this creativity in problem solving and conceptual change in problem solving that has to do with the improved design of the paintbrush as a pump. And I'll just maybe quickly, just show you the slide and not talk much about it, The interesting thing about it is that what it really resulted, so this is a real case, that the model of paintbrush changed drastically. It's like a Kuhnian kind of revolution when people came up with this different metaphor or different model. Because in the earlier model, the paint used to be stick to the fibers and used to be, when you paint some surface, it smears by friction or something like that. But in the new model, it's the space between the fibers that provides like capillary tube kind of thing, and then the paint gets sucked into the spaces between the fibers. So the fibers are actually not the medium of, they are really just trying to define the space in which the paint can be sucked. And also when you paint, you actually, when you bend the fibers, it's actually in the next slide. When you bend the fibers, the paint actually gets pushed through because of the differential pressure. So actually, now again, I should say that this model was like people came up with in 1940s or so, but people who do paintings, they were aware of that. Like if you do calligraphy or something like that, sometimes you have to pump the paint, pump the paintbrush, okay? Okay, so this is again now, I'll give you some examples in mathematics and then just flash you a couple of them, and then I want to read a long quote by Piaget, and then I'll close. So, this, you probably know the diagonalization argument that George Cantor tried to show that rationals which are dense have the same degree of cardinality as natural numbers. And again, if you look at the time, so what was happening is that for hundreds of years before that, people were puzzled about this nature of infinity, because it looks a little bit contradictory, because, like the set of even numbers is a subset of integers, but but if they're both infinite, okay? And it also has a religious thing, because sometimes people or many times people identified infinity with God, and they wanted to say that there's only one infinity, like there's only one God. So now the dense numbers are a little complicated, because of course you can say there's a problem with respect to like subsets also, like even numbers or real numbers, or sorry, even numbers and integers. But with the like rationals which are dense, that means that you take any two numbers and there are basically infinite within that, and then you take any two things, there is infinity within that. And as you probably all know that the mechanism that Cantor came with was actually very simple. I mean, I can explain this to now high school students, why there are the rationals, even though they are dense, they can be put in a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Now, actually, I was doing some research in it a few years back, and I actually looked at the correspondence that Cantor had with his contemporaries at the time. And again, he actually wanted to show that, because he was very buoyed by his proof that the rationals have the same cardinality as natural numbers, because again, he was getting closer to showing that there's only one God, there's only one infinity. So he really wanted to, he was very encouraged, and he thought now he will show that even real numbers have the same cardinality as natural numbers. But then he hit a counter example, and that's what, now we know that there are infinite levels of infinity and things like that. Okay, so I'll have, this is a kind of a long quote, but I'll just sort of read it for you. This is from Genetic Epistemology by Jean Piaget. It is agreed that logical and mathematical structures are abstract, whereas physical knowledge, the knowledge based on experiences in general, is concrete. But let us ask what logical and mathematical knowledge is abstracted from. There are two possibilities. The first is that when we act upon an object, our knowledge is derived from the object itself. This is the point of view of empiricism in general, and it is valid in the case of experimental or empirical knowledge for the most part. But there is a second possibility. When we are acting upon an object, we can also take into account the action itself, or operation if you will. Since the transformation can be carried out mentally, in this hypothesis, the abstraction is drawn not from the object that is acted upon, but from the action itself. It seems to me that this is the basis of logical and mathematical abstraction. In cases involving the physical world, the abstraction is abstraction from the objects themselves. A child, for instance, can heft objects in his hands and realize that they have different weights. That usually big things weigh more than little ones, but that sometimes little things weigh more than big ones. All this he finds out experientially, and his knowledge is abstracted from the objects themselves. But I should like to give you an example, just as primitive as that one, in which knowledge is abstracted from actions, from the coordination of actions, and not from objects. This example, one we have studied quite thoroughly with many children, was first suggested to me by a mathematician friend who quoted it as the point of departure of his interest in mathematics. When he was a small child, so that's the friend of Piaget, he was counting pebbles one day. He lined them up in a row, counted them from left to right, and got 10. Then just for fun, he counted them from right to left to see what number he would get, and was astonished that he got 10 again. He put the pebbles in a circle and counted them, and once again they were 10. He went around the circle in the other way and got 10 again. And no matter how he put the pebbles down, and when he counted them, the number came to 10. He discovered here what is known in mathematics as commutativity, that is, the sum is independent of the order. But how did he discover this? Is this commutativity a property of the pebbles? It is true that the pebbles, as it were, let him arrange them in various ways. He could not have done the same thing with drops of water. So in this sense, there was a physical aspect of his knowledge. But the order was not in the pebbles. It was he, the subject, who put the pebbles in line and then in a circle. Moreover, the sum was not in the pebbles themselves. It was he who united them. The knowledge that this future mathematician discovered that day was drawn then not from the physical properties of the pebbles, but from the actions that he carried out on the pebbles. This knowledge is what I call logical mathematical knowledge and not physical knowledge. The first type of abstraction from objects I shall refer to as simple abstraction, but the second type I shall call a reflective abstraction, using this term in a double sense. Okay, so that's the end of the long quote. And just to sort of, this again is a little bit, controversial position. Not many people agree with that, but there's a research, people are looking at it, that mathematical objects and operations are cognitive constructs, And mathematical theorems are truths about those constructs. Okay? And finally, the conclusions that, again, I'm repeating what I said earlier, that norms are ideals that a cognitive agent for us or a society strives for, but they are based on the current, under our current, or the society's current understanding of itself and the world. And as the agent evolves, norms are also revised, and the norms in that sense show the kind of what I call horizon effect, meaning that they recede and change as we approach them. Like when you're driving, you're aiming somewhere, but when you get a little closer, the horizon changes because new things come in your view, and then sometimes you have to redefine your goal. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions and comments, please. Professor Woleński.
I have two terminological objections.
Yeah, sure.
You say that descriptions are correct or not. When descriptions are or not, correct are sentences in descriptions. So I think that you simply confuse descriptions in the sense of Russell and descriptions as statements of a kind. The second objection is maybe minor but important. There is no degree of cardinality.
Sorry, say that again.
Cardinality is, is a number of elements and cannot have any degree.
Sure. Yes, well, I understand. The first thing I will say, yes, I've been actually a little bit sloppy in using terminology, so I admit that. But I can construct that argument more carefully. And the second thing is, yes, also I understand that part. And again, I cannot answer it briefly, but maybe. So I'll just pass it at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. Another question, please.
Thank you. This is really just an example that I would add to some of your examples. You talked about the term person or the concept of person. Similarly, a live issue in the antebellum United States, during the first half of the 19th century was whether the term men in the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed that all men are created equal, whether that term extended to blacks or not. And people like Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln insisted that it did, and defenders of slavery, of course, insisted that it didn't. And it's remarkable the extent to which many of the debates over the legitimacy or illegitimacy of slavery were focused on that term. So I think that tends to reinforce your point that broader normative debates tend to become focused on specific terms, specific concepts, which serve to structure those debates.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say, it's a good example and adds to this person debate. Thank you.
We still have time for questions. Well, if there are no further questions, I will thank you very much.
Again. Yeah.